Hi, everyone. Welcome to Talk It Up Tuesdays. Today, I am here with our law enforcement trainer, Pfahning, and we're going to talk about #MenToo, some of the challenges and barriers for men that are affected by sexual assault and abuse. But before we get started with this conversation, I want to take just a moment to tell you a little bit about the Turning Point. So we are a rape crisis center based here in Plano, and we serve survivors of sexual violence in the North Texas area. Our mission is to provide counseling, education, and advocacy for all those impacted by sexual violence. We have a crisis hotline that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That number is 1-800-886-7273. Well, Brian, thanks so much for making the time to have a conversation with me today. I feel like this topic of male survivors is so counter to the narrative we normally hear. And so I'm glad that we're able to talk and maybe dispel some of the myths or false understandings that we have.
Absolutely.
So I wonder if just getting started, if you can talk a little bit, both from your experience working in law enforcement, as well as just on the data, what you see about the statistics of the prevalency of male survivors.
Well, it's kind of hard to say, because here's the cold hard fact is that it is not only underreported traditionally all the way across the board, but is very much underreported when it comes to male sexual assault. So the numbers that we talk about are just numbers of people who've actually reported, but not necessarily the numbers that are actually out there. And in fact, you would assume, because of the stereotypes and the different things that have happened, and there being even more barriers in some instances for males to report, that the numbers would be way higher than are actually reported. If you look at things like RAIN, and RAIN is a website that you can get a lot of information off of. I know you've got some other ones too, but they're basically saying that like 1 out of every 10 sexual assaults is male, and so is a male victim. And so that's a lot higher than what people would actually think. And traditionally in law enforcement, we, because the majority of victims are female, we tend to create a system in which we take care of that. But then we have to make sure that we also take care of the other, genders and other people out there, like transgenders and even males. And so today we're talking about males and how that's a little bit more difficult for them to access the system in some instances. And just because of just the way males are seen as, it's not easy to sexually assault a male and those types of things, it makes it very, very difficult for them to come forward. And then when they do, to continue with the process.
Yeah, so I think if you look at our practice, that we see both in forensic exams, but especially in our counseling practice, only about 10%, well, I don't know if I want to say only, but about 10% of the individuals we see are actually men. And we know that there are stereotypes and barriers for men accessing mental health services as well. So, but that tracks kind of nationally with the reported numbers. Although I will say that in 2015, Texas did this survey prevalence on individuals who had experienced some sort of unwanted sexual assault, sexual abuse in their lifetime. And that number for women was 2 in 5. And I believe for men, it was 1 in 5 when they were doing phone calls anonymous that hadn't necessarily been reported, but that people were willing to share. So I think that tracks exactly with what you're saying, that just the amount of information that we have is so, it only captures a very thin slice of what males experience when it comes to sexual assault or sexual violence. One thing I did notice in one of the research papers that I had read, it mentioned that while most women experience assault during the ages of maybe 15 to 17, for men, that age range tends to be younger. So that's just one of the different dynamics that you might see when it comes to male survivors, is that many experience it during that late childhood tween age. So,
Yeah, and that also kind of leads into the fact that, when you have those types of things happening at a younger age, then you will typically have less reporting in some instances, or delayed reporting because of what happens. And then you have, this whole idea that, as uh a male becomes a man, and you have all of these gender roles and gender stereotypes that are out there, then it becomes harder for them to come forward with those accusations, because they're like, hey, this happened to me, but I was a child, but I don't want to deal with this when I get older, and those types of things. So that tracks very consistently with the data that we actually have.
yeah. So what do you see are the major barriers to men reporting? And you've mentioned some of those, but more broadly, thinking about men, and I know that we use that term pretty broadly, like within kind of that category. Obviously, there are going to be additional barriers if for transgender men or members of the gay and bisexual community, or different ethnicities or races, depending on community relationships with. So I understand that, but just kind of broadly touching on
Sure.
men, what do you think some of those barriers are?
Well, I think the whole idea is, and the reason why, we kind of came up with this whole idea, there was the Me Too movement. And then I started looking at this going, wait a minute, we need to do hashtag men too, because the hard part is that if you look at a lot of the literature, because of the way the statistics have been running, and it's not necessarily the system's fault, but a lot of the literature is, if you read it, it's she is the victim and he is the perpetrator. And I think in some instances, when men access the system, or males in general access the system, then they're already accessing a system that, if they read the literature, they go on websites, they go on these things, they're seeing, wait a minute, she's the victim and he's the perpetrator. And so I think there's this, underpinning of, not necessarily bias, but just something where it makes it a little bit more difficult for the male to think, okay, this is a system for me. Because if it's built around and to support what in the literature and what they see is primarily women, then how do they go about accessing those systems? And, the whole idea of even sane nurses, there's very, very, very few male sane nurses out there. And there's a lot of males that don't want a female, doing the exam because they're embarrassed or whatever. And so there's just certain things that are there that kind of just start automatically as barriers. And then it's also, just from that perspective of just the embarrassment. And I think traditionally in law enforcement, it's changed now, but for a long time, there was, well, men can't be raped. Men can't be sexually assaulted. They're too big. They're too strong. They can't be sexually assaulted. And that's absolutely false. That's absolutely not true. Um, Anybody in any situation can be sexually assaulted, whether they're male, female, transgender, LGBTQ. It doesn't matter. When somebody is taking advantage of someone else, it's not about gender, it's not about that person, it's about power and control. And so anyone can be taken advantage of. And I think that has kind of maybe been lost a little bit in the message that we're putting out there.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't help. So many of these rape crisis centers, when they were formed during the 70s and 80s, so many of them had Women's Center actually in the title. And I think that what was so critical, bringing attention to the problem, unanticipated consequences of maybe stigmatizing or isolating men that are affected by this violence as well. One of the things that you brought up that I think is important, well, I guess this kind of relates more to stereotypes and myths for male survivors and how we dismantle them. But one of the issue that you brought up, obviously, that anyone can be a victim of sexual assault, it doesn't matter, is very key. Sometimes I think we have these narratives because when you look at the data, we know mentally that most men are not perpetrators of any sort of violence. However, the majority of perpetrators tend to be men, even, and the victims, 10% is still a really large number. So it's not that committing these acts is just like a woman committing the act against a man, which I think sometimes gets a little confusing, but it's also violence that can be perpetrated by men onto other men as well.
Yeah, I think that that's the whole idea. Is I think we because of the way, just everything has gone, and over the past few years we've changed kind of this idea of what relationships are between people. I think where we had traditionally back in the 70s, 80s, even early 90s, we had decided, had kind of looked at things when these centers and all of these things were being put together, was that it was a man versus a woman, and we didn't account for some of those things that were what we know today are men versus men, women versus women. We can have women versus men. We can have all different types of offenses that are happening. And it's not just this whole narrative of, oh, well, men can't be sexually assaulted because females can't overpower them. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about females can overpower them in certain instances. There's lots of different ways that can happen. We've already talked about the statistic that a lot of boys are sexually assaulted, and I tell you from just anecdotal experience, it's females that are doing that as well. So it's not just men doing it, it's females in positions of power or whatever that are doing that to child, males. And so it's just this, I think we have to step back and kind of, we're doing a really good job in society at looking at a lot of different types of relationships. We're kind of breaking down some of these social norms or these narratives that kind of locked us into a certain type of thinking. And I think that our profession in the Turning Point and in this sexual assault arena just has probably a little bit more work to do when it comes to breaking down some of those narratives, because it's not I truly believe that if it was more that we could break that down just a little bit more, you may end up seeing an uptick in actual adult males coming in and reporting, saying, hey, this happened to me, which helps the system into all the way around, helps the survivor, helps law enforcement figure out who's out there doing it. It also hopefully helps us develop programs that can keep, prevention and those types of things from happening.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a really, really important point. So are there any other sort of stereotypes or myths that you see that are particularly harmful, stigmatizing? We've talked about a number of them, but one thing you did mention, sorry, before I go to that idea of power and control, I think it's important to mention it's not just physical power and control. And so you've got social power, privilege, even manipulation and coercion that can happen to create those different dynamics, which is what sexual assault, sexual abuse tends to thrive on. So going back to that, I just wondered if you see any other particularly harmful myths or other ways that maybe individuals can work to dismantle them.
I think just basically, if we just look at the victims and the survivors as that, and not just the gender or that, because I think, in a lot of instances when we think of males and we think of sexual assault, like you said, we don't say that males are committing sexual assault, even though there's a good portion of the offenses are committed by males. But it's like, how do we just change some of that language so that we don't end up with that it's, survivor versus perpetrator instead of he, she. And I think that some of those things that are out there, the most damaging one out there particularly is, there's two that I can think of. One is that a male can't be sexually assaulted, especially by a female. And number two is that we have to break down some of these embarrassment type things, so that if a male is sexually assaulted, whether it's by a female or a male, we have to break down that embarrassment and that barrier for them to come and report. And because that's one of the biggest, I think, barriers for and myths, is that because we say, oh, men can't be sexually assaulted because they should be able to take care of themselves, well, then that perpetuates the whole idea, well, if I report it, then I'm saying that I couldn't take care of myself and I couldn't protect myself. When, like you said, it's not just physical power, it's social influence, it's a lot of emotional control. People don't realize that emotional control is way more important, way more potent than physical control any day, and so, it's really hard to get these people, get males to report, because they feel like, oh, if I do that, I'm going to fall into that whole idea of I didn't protect myself, I didn't, or somebody's just not going to believe that I was able to be sexually assaulted.
Yeah. So after someone's been assaulted, we know that it can have short-term, long-term, emotional, mental, all sorts of consequences on an individual's life, regardless of the gender of the person that was assaulted. Like, this applies to everybody. So I wonder what you see as passive healing, support, or justice, particularly for male survivors, especially in mind that we have so many barriers for men seeking mental health support and other that maybe aren't necessarily related to sexual assault, but just in general that prevent men from seeking out the care and support that they need for healing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all plays together. I mean, it's really this whole idea, and I think it just needs to be this paradigm shift, and it's going to be a little bit, it's going to take time, but I think it needs to happen. Is this whole paradigm shift of for men, because it's going to be difficult for males to access a lot of those systems, because you know domestic violence is the same way, sexual assault is the same way, mental health, males don't typically go and seek mental health, like you said. So all of that stuff kind of wraps together. And so the idea is that creating a system that is it, kind of a bad word to use, but welcoming and inviting, but something that's, I think more the idea is validating and affirming. Those two words would be probably better used. So something that's validating, affirming, saying, hey, we're here for you. And, we want you to come and access those things, because but honestly, it's going to be up to the males themselves. And so that paradigm is going to have to shift as well.
Yeah. So probably that if you're looking forward into the future, a lot of that is influenced by how we talk about these issues within our families, how we talk about them in our communities and in media. All of this probably is going to have to be part of that, changing that paradigm and that dynamic of what's acceptable, but what's encouraged, and that every single person is deserving of healing and justice, regardless of what happens.
Right.
One thing I found really interesting was on the RAIN site, when it specifically talks to supporting male survivors, it gives a list of, how to support male survivors. And that's exactly the same as it is for any other survivor. And so really that taking the gender out of the equation and just saying, how can we support this individual?
Right.
Again, that validation, that affirming, that providing and connecting with resources is really that critical point.
Yeah, because I think the whole idea is that we had, and not because we were trying to do anything, nefarious or anything, but I think just the system itself, like you said, women's centers, these rape crisis centers started out that way. And I think that language just was kind of put in there, and that's just the way it was. And I think only until maybe a few years back, when a lot of these things started happening, we started, looking at how can we, do better. We have to look into our own internal systems and go, okay, it's not about gender. It's about a human being who has been, violently, assaulted, and their personhood has been, assaulted and taken away from them. It has nothing to do with whether they're male, female, transgender, LGBTQ. This is a human being that has been violated to the point to where, their own personhood has been assaulted. And so you're right. The same way you treat them is the same way you treat, males, is the same way you treat females, which is the same way you treat transgenders. It's all, anybody that's been sexually assaulted, it's all the same. We're all human beings. We all have the same physiological and psychological needs. And so I think that's where the paradigm needs to shift. And like I said, maybe changing those language from he and she to perpetrator and or survivor. And so, you know, those types of things where you can take those genders out so that people don't feel, so that when people are accessing these systems and they look and they go, oh, well, that's not for me because it says she is the victim and he is the perpetrator. And I'm not saying that everyone does that, but a lot of the literature out there does. And it's not because they're being mean, it's just because that's what was supported for so long. And so, you know, the more we get males to report and the more we look into this and try to change that paradigm, I think the more we'll see how much better we can be in, you know, helping and affirming everyone, not just one set of people.
Well, Ryan, thank you so much for sharing and taking this issue with me. And so I just appreciate you taking the time. Is there anything else you would say to people or anything else that or we have?
I just think that, you know, if we just step back and understand that we're all in this together and that we're all in this to make things better for everyone. And that's kind of where we're at. It's not about males. It's not about females. It's not about any classification. It's about human beings helping human beings, and that we're all there to help support and affirm each other.
Great. Well, Brian, thanks so much for taking the time, and we will be back here next week for Talk It Up Tuesday, and we'll be having some suggestions of how to respond to friends and family members if they disclose to you that they can. So we'll see you back here next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
All right. Bye.